Bendy and the Dark Revival is not a scary game. Now that being said, I don't think that Bendy and the Dark Revival is a bad game. I do genuinely love it. It's very polished, well made, and does a lot of things right. But like the majority of indie horror games that have been released over the past 3 years, it also does a lot of things wrong. So in this video, we are going to be doing a full in-depth review of Bendy and the Dark Revival, its gameplay, its characters, its horror elements, and why those elements don't always work. At its core, Bendy and the Dark Revival is a game about a young woman named Audrey getting sucked into an alternate dimension made of ink, amidst a power struggle between an ink demon and a man named Wilson. And most elements of the game are done much better than its predecessor, Bendy and the Ink Machine. Graphics, character design, story, all of which we'll touch on later, are far superior to Bendy and the Ink Machine. Dark Revival is without a doubt a better game. However, there is one area of the game that I believe that Bendy and the Ink Machine does surpass Dark Revival in, and that is the horror and mystery elements of the game's atmosphere. Ink Machine does this in two ways: escalation and fear of the unknown. To demonstrate what I mean first, let's take a look at Bendy and the Ink Machine. At the beginning of the game, you are under the presumption that you have entered a completely normal cartoon production studio. Just a few wooden desks, a main entrance area, and an ink machine. And even as things slowly start to get weirder, accumulating at the end of Chapter 1 with the appearance of the Ink Demon, and later on Sammy Lawrence, the environment we inhabit still very much resembles that of a studio. But then, as we get into Chapter 3, it becomes far more clear that as you descend lower down, this is anything but a normal place. Chapter 3 introduces all sorts of places that you'd never find in a small animation studio, like areas that look like people's houses, an enormous toy factory, an entire ink-soaked floor, a massive shrine dedicated to Alice Angel, and the game even acknowledges this escalation with Henry commenting, "I don't remember any of this," as he enters the Heavenly Toys area of the game. And especially by chapters 4 and 5, you really start to realize that you aren't in anything even resembling an animation studio anymore, but a vast complex housing an entire deconstructed amusement park, numerous floors, underground rivers, places that look like little towns, and many other areas that continue to expand on what the game was originally in its early chapters. Now, a lot of this, to be fair, may come from the fact that Meatley had no idea what he was doing with the story, but it still works in creating this atmosphere that is constantly throwing new stuff at you. As you continue to fight increasingly weird monsters in an environment that grows more and more expansive, everything about the game is continuously escalated through Henry's campaign. This really helped to establish the game's horror atmosphere and make things interesting. You never knew what was coming next. It kept you on your feet the entire game, dreading how the world of Bendy is going to develop and what turn it will take you in next, creating an underlying dread. And all of this plays very heavily into the fear of the unknown. Now, Bendy and the Dark Revival tried something very similar to this, and was nowhere near as successful. When you first find yourself in the inky world of Bendy and the Dark Revival, you are already in an environment that is very much akin to something you'd find in Bendy Chapter 4 or Bendy Chapter 5, with a fairly large atrium area and huge ink-filled pond. This game throws you right into the madness, and doesn't really build on the initial game's environment in the same way the first one did. This in turn gave the game a completely different feel. The escalation in the first game created a very confusing and lonely environment for the player, almost leaving the game to feel like a journey through a liminal space. While Dark Revival feels a lot more like your standard action and adventure game, losing a lot of what made the original so unnerving. Now, I will give credit where credit is due. There is one point in Bendy and the Dark Revival where this escalation was done perfectly. This, of course, being the City of Broken Dreams at the beginning of Dark Revival Chapter 4. Throughout most of Bendy and the Dark Revival, you have the exact same end goal that you did the whole time in Bendy and the Ink Machine: escape the studio. However, this game hits you with a huge twist. You actually do. After surviving the usual gauntlet of Lost One looting and overly convoluted puzzles that these games have become known for throwing at you, near the actual entrance of the studio, looking out over a skyline. Then, just a few moments later, after getting Baby Bendy onto your team, you actually exit the studio through a subway-esque street access tunnel, confirming that you are not just inside a massive backrooms-like animation studio complex, but an entire inky world. Dark Revival does continue to expand on the world of Bendy and the Ink Machine in this chapter for sure, but here's the issue. Instead of taking this concept and running with it, after you leave the city section, it just kind of backtracks into more of the same. And more specifically, the way some of these interior environments are actually designed can end up feeling a bit repetitive. Now don't get me wrong, this is a beautiful game in almost every way, and in terms of graphical and animation quality, the original cannot hold a candle. Everything about Dark Revival is just amazing to look at, and you can tell that it is a very polished game with few cracks. The parts of the game set in the real world look absolutely incredible. The Meatly nailed the lighting and textures, giving the game a realistic atmosphere while still managing to have a very distinctive art style. And don't even get me started on the cartoon world. Everything about it is a massive improvement from the first game. Every part of the game feels so rich with content and set pieces and things to explore. And the overall art style of the game looks absolutely incredible. The textures and models are so much more detailed, and as compared to the first game, which had a very distinctively yellow color palette, which could get a bit overwhelming at times, Bendy and the Dark Revival took on a much more orangey red look with heavy blue undertones, which adds a lot of much needed contrast to the game and really improves the atmosphere of what would otherwise be a very monochromatic game. And of course, the ink. The ink in this game just looks stellar. It genuinely looks like this viscous black goo with amazing shading and reflection on the models. The character designs also really get to shine in Dark Revival. Alice Angel, for instance. Compared to what we see in Bendy and the Ink Machine, her model has gotta be one of the biggest improvements. The level of detail on her face, her texture, and the actual anatomy and detail level of her model are all massively improved from Bendy and the Ink Machine. Bendy and the Dark Revival is also the first time we get to see a lot of human characters. Henry, Wilson, and Joey Drew all look great, and do a pretty good job of balancing realism with the game's distinctive cartoony art style. Now, all that being said, I do have one small critique of the game's environments. When playing through Bendy and the Dark Revival, despite them being much richer with more set dressing and more details than the first game, a lot of the environments seem to kind of blend together and aren't very memorable. Let me explain what I mean. In the original Bendy, in almost every chapter, there was one or two rooms that really stood out and stuck in your brain as a crucial element of that chapter. In Chapter 1, that giant ink machine room, where the machine itself is raised out of the ground, is unforgettable. Heavenly Toys and Alice Angel's weird shrine thing had a similar effect in Chapter 3, along with the ink-filled level 14, which creates a much more varied atmosphere than most of Dark Revival. Of course, you also have the giant ink-filled river and amusement park from Chapter 4, and the sewer-like tunnels, or of course, the giant ink machine room from Chapter 5. Whenever you think of Bendy and the Ink Machine, these are the areas that usually first come to your mind. They keep the game interesting, and have you always guessing at what's coming next. Dark Revival doesn't really have anything like that, apart from that city area we discussed previously, making a lot of the game just kind of blend together. However, I do think that Bendy and the Dark Revival does certainly make up for this in a few huge ways. Its characters and the twists and turns that the story takes really help to make this game come to life. Without getting too much into the story, as I'll likely save that for a future video, there are so many twists that this game takes, and a lot of this is told to the player directly through expositional storytelling with actual characters. Every time you encounter Joey Drew in the game, there were big lore reveals, stuff that had been theorized for a long time that was just being outright confirmed, like things about the nature of the cycle and the world that Joey Drew created, or that the version of Henry in the Ink world is actually a clone of the real Henry made by Joey specifically so Joey could torture him, or the fact that Audrey is Joey's daughter. The scenes with Henry or the ones with Wilson on the train also revealed a ton about this world and gave us a level of character development that we never came even close to in Ink Machine, outside of the audio logs, which of course did further expand on the world of Bendy. But of course, probably the biggest element of horror in Bendy and the Ink Machine was the Ink Demon himself. In terms of sheer character design, the Ink Demon scene in Bendy and the Dark Revival outmatches the design from Bendy and the Ink Machine 10 times over. I mean, there's just no comparison. With a set of human-like teeth, misshapen, oversized hands, a monstrous stature, and spikes protruding from his back. This design of the Ink Demon is definitely terrifying, and makes the Ink Demon from the first game look like a joke. But can the gameplay of the Ink Demon match his horrifying appearance? Well, that's where things get a bit more complicated. For most of Bendy and the Ink Machine, the Ink Demon's appearances were completely scripted, except for Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, anytime you were out in the open, during Alice Angel's fetch quests, the Ink Demon would appear completely at random, and chase you down and then kill you, unless you quickly found a place to hide. Now, I cannot stress enough how genuinely terrifying this was. The fact that he was controlled more or less randomly, with you in this enclosed space, really made it feel like you were at the mercy of the Ink Demon. Like, when Chapter 3 first came out, I genuinely could not play it by myself for ages. So, how does Bendy and the Dark Revival handle the Ink Demon? In the Dark Revival, the Ink Demon does actually function very similar to how he does in Chapter 3. If you spend too long out in the open trying to complete one task, the Ink Demon will appear, and if you don't find a place to hide, then bam, you are dead. Except this mechanic has one major difference to the one found in Chapter 3. Instead of when the Ink Demon is activated, Bendy actually spawns into the map and hunts you down, this mechanic is quite literally just a countdown timer. The screen turns black and white for a few seconds, and then once an arbitrary number is up, if you have not found a place to hide, you just die. In my opinion, this takes all the strategy and fear out of the mechanic that it had in Chapter 3. What made the Ink Demon so imposing then was the feeling of knowing that he could appear at any time, and knowing that you'd actually have to avoid him as you watched him slink down the hallway towards you slowly with that devilish grin on his face. There was so much variability and strategy in what you could actually do here, and when he did appear, even when there was nowhere near to hide nearby, because he was an actual entity who existed in the environment, it wasn't always a foregone conclusion. You could escape. In the Dark Revival, however, it's pretty much either there's a place to hide directly next to you, or there isn't. Fear comes from the unknown, the unpredictable, and the mechanic in Chapter 3 had that unpredictability to make it truly anxiety-inducing, something that the Ink Demon in the Dark Revival certainly doesn't possess. The Ink Demon, though, isn't the only enemy in this game that doesn't exactly have the greatest mechanics. For starters, let's talk about the Widows, and more specifically, the boss fight that ensues with the giant one of these spiders, the Widow King. You first encounter the Widows after making it through the artist's rest area of the studio and to an elevator on the upper floors, which of course is inevitably sabotaged by the keepers and then crashes down into the lower depths of the studio where these spider-like monsters reside. Now, the boss fight with the Widow King is technically only one of 3 boss fights in the entire game. The other one, of course, being with Ship Ahoy Wilson at the end of the game, which we will touch on soon. Trust me, we're getting there. And the Alice Angel fight, which, to be honest, was more of just a overly complicated puzzle that you had to solve with Alice shooting at you rather than an actual proper boss fight. Honestly, this fight with the Widow King was one of the only points in the game where I actually got scared. The claustrophobic, frantic, and anxiety-inducing environment of the Widow Nest is definitely pretty unnerving, and the design of the Widow King himself is one of the most disturbing ones in the entire game. The boss fight itself is fairly straightforward. Navigate around the room, dodge the Widow King's attack, and then hit him with your gent pipe. However, there is one pretty big issue with this boss fight that makes it incredibly easy to cheese. The Widow King has 3 stages. One where he's chasing Audrey around the room trying to hit her, one where he flies up to the ceiling and starts spawning smaller widows, and a 3rd stage that is the same as the first. These stages are triggered by the Widow King reaching a certain amount of health. Now, the big issue here is that the phase that the Widow King is in does not reset even when you die, meaning that even if he kills you,
he keeps the same amount of health that he had previously, meaning that hitting him, dying on purpose to regenerate your own health, and then respawning and hitting him again and repeating this until he is killed is a valid strategy, which again makes the boss fight super easy to cheese and takes away a lot of the stakes, a lot of the fun out of this boss fight that it might otherwise have if the Widow King reset whenever you die. Another thing that definitely takes away from this boss fight feeling as fun and as dynamic as it could have is the combat system in this game. I don't care what you guys say, but the combat system in this game is janky as hell. When you actually go to hit enemies, they almost always hit you back, since their attack range is the same as yours. And while this may technically be more realistic, it doesn't really make for a very fun gameplay experience. Because of this, when fighting enemies, whenever you can hit them, they can hit you, basically making it so your only recourse is to hit the enemy and back away, then rinse and repeat and just hope to God that you don't have more than 3 of them after you at one given time, which just kind of makes combat a repetitive, painful experience. Even after you get good at it, it still just comes out as boring. Combat in games should feel satisfying and exciting. It should feel good to smack enemies over the head with a weapon, but in Bendy the Dark Revival, it definitely doesn't. The least the Meatly could have done is add some sort of special attack or combos to keep combat interesting, but he just didn't, again leaving combat feeling very boring. The only time you ever get close to anything like that is when you upgrade your gent pipe, when you gain access to this heavy swing attack and stun attack, which, to be granted, definitely are fun to play around with and do help a lot with the problems I previously addressed. However, it certainly shouldn't take you upgrading your weapon for combat to not feel like a chore. These problems could be pretty easily fixed as well. All it would take is enemies' range to be decreased very slightly and adding some sort of critical hit attack or combo attack to the gent pipe to help the attacks themselves feel more lively. One thing I will certainly give this combat system credit for as a huge plus is when using the flow ability while fighting to warp around and escape enemies, it does become a lot more fun. And you being able to use that ability while fighting is definitely a cool mechanic, and can create some very fun and interesting situations, along with the banishing power, which a lot of times I find the best way to actually utilize this ability is when there is a lot of enemies near you. You can come in and knock off a few of the enemies in the area to create a more manageable amount that can be taken out with the gent pipe. Now, let's talk about the enemies themselves. The main enemies in Bendy the Dark Revival are Lost Ones, and they are just fine. They do what they're supposed to do, they swarm at you and they try to hit you when they see you. My main issue with these guys is actually that they are more or less the only type of enemy that can be found in the entire game, which is surprisingly odd because the universe of Bendy has so many interesting creatures that it could have pulled from to have a wide variety of enemies. But the only real variety you get in Dark Revival is these random cosmetic changes and accessories to the Lost Ones. Some of them have hats or mohawks or bow ties. I really don't understand why they did this, as it makes all the enemy encounters feel very samey. And there's many other types of enemies that are actually in the game. They're just very, very underutilized. I think there was either 1 or 2 searcher encounters in the entire game, and the Butcher Gang would just kind of pop up randomly with no rhyme or reason and then attack you and leave. It does seem like the Meatly wanted to give the Butcher Gang and Searchers different game mechanics in this game, but doing so just makes the rest of enemy encounters feel very bland. As well as I previously mentioned, the Butcher Gang encounters, which do get to be very annoying and more or less pointless. A great example of this is Carly, the new 4th member of the Butcher Gang. She had a ton of potential, but in the end, all she turned out to be was an enemy who would literally just pop up completely randomly, hit you once, and then disappear.
And the attack from her when she does pop up is completely unavoidable too. There's no strategy here, no point to her appearances, and at the end of the day, she is just more of an annoyance than anything else. Carly even being a part of the game at all is completely optional. The only way you'd ever even encounter her is if you go into this secret room towards the beginning of the game and open this wooden crate that she's trapped inside. And it's a shame too, because her mechanic of disappearing and then moving to another place and reappearing could have actually been a pretty interesting mechanic in regular combat alongside the other enemies. It really is disappointing to see that the majority of enemies in the Bendy universe were criminally underutilized like the Searchers, or implemented completely wrong like the Butcher Gang, which leaves the lost ones to fill in the gaps. And trust me, they get stale very quickly. Another character we need to talk about is the Keepers. But honestly, the name Keepers just sounds kind of stupid, so from now on we're going to refer to these guys exclusively as Kyle. Which honestly sounded pretty funny to me when I was writing this script at like 3 AM, but now reading it back while I'm recording, I have absolutely no idea what I was thinking. But you know what, I'm just gonna go with it. Kyle acts as a pretty generic stealth enemy in Dark Revival, with no way to kill him, functioning very similar to the Projectionist from Bendy the Ink Machine, with a vision cone emanating from his head that if you get caught in, will cause him to chase you and kill you in 2 hits. Now my only issue with this guy is he tends to break a lot. There's this one part towards the end of the game where after fighting Alice Angel in that crazy machine gun showdown and coming into this hallway area, you need to retrieve and fix a music box to distract Kyle. Now, the game barely gives you any idea on how to do this or where the music box is. I spent literal hours searching all over this game trying to find this thing. And what makes this section so much more infuriating is that the part of the game that you actually progress through after finding said music box is completely accessible and open to explore even if you don't have it yet, leading you to think that the music box is somewhere in this area, because there's no wall, door, or anything stopping you from going through this whole section. But the music box isn't in this section. It's all the way back here. And it's insanely easy to miss because it doesn't stand out from its environment at all. There's no highlight on it or any sort of indicator telling you to interact with it, so it's very easy to miss. And on my first playthrough of this game, I just completely dismissed this little thing here as set dressing. But it's not set dressing, it's actually the music box that you've been needing this whole time. And oh yeah, Kyle. The Kyles in this section will constantly break, freeze in place, kill you when they clearly weren't supposed to, you name it. These guys have bugs galore, and I know I wasn't the only one who had a lot of trouble with this section. Watching playthroughs of this game, many other people were confused and lost here, having absolutely no idea what to do, where to go, or how to complete the objective at hand. Now, while we're on the topic of characters, I think we need to talk about the ones that don't try to kill you. Alice, Boris, and Porter. Much like the Butcher Gang, these guys were criminally underutilized in the game. The marketing leading up to release made it seem like these guys would play a major role in Audrey's journey. The Bendy Twitter account released a lot of little informational cards about these guys, revealing stuff about their personalities and giving information about them that made it seem like they'd play a larger role in the story, and describing each one of their character traits in depth. They were even put on the cover of the game itself, but they were hardly in the game at all. Alice appeared like twice and had a few moments where you could talk to her. Porter literally appeared once and just acted as a device to give you the teleportation ability. Even this guy, who was plastered all over the marketing for this game, only had like one use, making you do one tiny mission for him towards the end of the game, which isn't even required to beat the game. There's so much more they could have done with these characters. Have you do missions of some sort for them, made them merchants that you could buy supplies from, and give them little pieces of dialogue that develop their character along the way, which is all stuff that the marketing for the game kind of implied that would happen. They could have even just done what was done in Chapter 5 and have them go along with Audrey directly on a part of her journey, and fight for her and help her along the way while giving her actual advice. Just anything to make them feel like an actual part of this world. But the only time we really ever got to see these guys in action alongside Audrey was the ending. Oh yeah, the ending. The final section of the game requires Audrey to fight this giant crab creature made from Wilson and a new cartoon character named Ship Ahoy Dudley. After Wilson revealed his end plan to overtake the power of the Ink Demon by using Audrey's soul to inhabit a more powerful cartoon character, and Audrey not wanting this to happen tricked Wilson into becoming the cartoon himself. But since Wilson didn't have a pure soul and all that, he turns into a malformed and monstrous version of the character. Then of course a final boss fight ensues. Now this boss fight is frankly kinda boring. The fight has two main stages. In the first stage, Wilson switches between these gear throwing attacks that you have to dodge, and attacks where he throws his anchor out at you trying to crush you. Also in the room with you, you have 4 of these signal towers that have to be deactivated. But the deactivation switch you'd normally use your gent pipe on is covered by these metal plates. So that means you have to, you guessed it, stand near the metal plates and wait for Wilson to throw his anchor, and then dodge the attack so he'll break open the plate so you can deactivate the tower. The whole system functioning very similar to the Beast Bendy fight from Chapter 5. After you've deactivated 2 of these towers, you are swarmed with lost ones infused with color, who basically just act as a mid-fight healing ability. They do little to no damage, and heal you once you kill them. After all 4 of these towers are deactivated, Ship Ahoy Wilson enters his second stage. Now this one is extremely annoying. In this phase, Wilson has 2 attacks. An attack where he charges at you with his anchor and tries to kill you that he'll repeat a number of times before going into this anchor swinging attack. If you successfully dodge this, you'll be able to hit him, but only from the front, which I cannot tell you how much of a pain it was to actually get around to his torso before he was ready to attack again. I died during this fight more times than I would publicly like to admit, and he takes quite a few hits to actually kill. Overall, this fight kind of fell into the same trap that a lot of other boss fights from the Bendy series fall into, which is feeling repetitive, relying too heavily on puzzles, and not really giving any opportunity for actual strategy or combat. Most fights in the Bendy series follow more or less this formula. Beat a puzzle that weakens the boss, and then dodge ranged attacks until the boss freezes for a moment, take a swing at him, rinse and repeat. Now this is actually the bones for a pretty decent fight. However, because of the way it's structured, it doesn't really allow for a lot of player variety, and every fight ends up looking more or less the same. Perhaps adding more attacks and giving Audrey a way to actually fight back in a back and forth battle like most boss fights, instead of only having these small windows for her to hit him, would help a lot with making this fight feel more dynamic, and make the main stages of the battle feel much more exciting and less formulaic. Overall, this fight was sort of a pain, even if parts of it were fun. But it's what came right after this fight that I really want to talk about, which was, in my opinion, probably the most fun part of the entire game. Once Ship Ahoy Wilson is damaged by Audrey, the Ink Demon suddenly swoops in to finish him off in a Jurassic Park dinosaur-type brawl, which was freaking awesome to watch. After that, the Ink Demon kills Wilson and absorbs Audrey's body into his own after Audrey loses her legs during the fight. Yes, this game is very weird. Once Audrey becomes part of the Ink Demon, they together form Beast Bendy and go on a rampage throughout the studio, smashing down walls and killing hordes of lost ones alongside the friends Audrey made along the way, fighting for you. I cannot tell you how much fun Beast Bendy is to control. After getting used to the janky controls and rotating Beast Bendy with a scroll wheel, smashing down the lost ones in the walls of the studio feels extremely satisfying. The Meatly totally nailed the animations here. And yes, all these characters coming together to help Audrey vanquish the Ink Demon and escape the studio as she rampages through it does feel a bit corny and deviates from the darker themes that this game has established, but it totally works here. This scene isn't scary, but it doesn't have to be. It feels like a fitting, satisfying conclusion to the game's story. The majority of Dark Revival was about tying up loose ends and laying the pieces of the story out in the open to finally be revealed. And this conclusion really puts a bow on that. Through all the twists and turns that the game threw at us, this ending feels deserved. It feels right. So was Bendy and the Dark Revival a bad game? No, not by any stretch. From its graphics to its gameplay, it did most things right. Yes, it did have a lot of flaws, most of which I called out in this video, but overall, it is a much more polished and well-rounded game than its predecessor. Yes, Bendy and the Dark Revival did fail on most of its horror elements, but I don't think it's really a horror game at this point. It's made the transition to a sci-fi fantasy storyline, and as I said earlier, I don't really think that's a bad thing. The story achieved what it was trying to do, and other series like FNAF have successfully made the transition from horror to sci-fi. Yes, the gameplay is flawed, but a lot of the flaws I pointed out are things that could be pretty easily fixed in a patch. Because Dark Revival is a fairly well-designed and well-made game, even if the gameplay can be fairly contrived at some points, it's not to the point where it was distracting. Bendy and the Dark Revival still makes for a relatively fun player experience, and I am definitely excited to see what the Meatly does in the future, whether that be a DLC or another game outside of the Bendy title. So that video was a little bit different. I've never really done like a long form kind of essay review of a game before. Please tell me what you guys think of that in the comment section. I would really like to hear your feedback on this one. You know, I'm kind of trying to dip my toes into the long-form game review essay sphere. You know, obviously I'll never make like an 8-hour one, because that's just ridiculous. I mean, what kind of monster does that? But I do have a few more ideas for games that I could kind of do this, like, in-depth gameplay critique of. And, of course, I'll probably make some theories for Bendy, too, because I've already put together a bunch of stuff that Super Harbro and MatPat and the other usual suspects I've just kind of looked over. But yeah, that was the video. Make sure to like and subscribe to boost all the engagement and watch time of this stuff I pretend not to care about, and please join the Discord server for the love of God, and goodbye. I'll see you in the next one.